Hey kids, I just wanted to respond a little bit to the discussion, the Obrien discussion that's going on. I'm really enjoying our conversation, and I wanted to see if I could clarify a couple of things for you. And this is the first thing. The first thing is that a story or a poem or any kind of created fiction, it bears more resemblance to a painting or a piece of music than it does to a news account of something, meaning that the writer, like the artist or like the musician, they take the elements that they have at hand and they combine those elements using the craftsmanship that they've learned and practiced in their careers, and they make a created thing. So a story or a poem or a play or anything like that is a created object. Everything deliberately contributes to the overall impression that the writer or the painter or the artist is desiring to achieve. So the first question to ask is not, did this really happen? Because a lot of times you can't determine that, and most of the time, almost always, it doesn't matter. So if we look at, let's use the Obrien story, the things they carried. If we look at that story and we say, oh, well, this is an eyewitness account of something that happened during the Vietnam War, or we say, no, this is nothing, this didn't happen at all, neither of those discussions really gets us anywhere because they don't matter. The job of the literary analyst is to look at the thing itself and say, okay, here is how it was created, here are the elements, here are how the elements work, and then to make the assertion about what we've noticed and how it works. And I will submit to you that that increases one's pleasure, sheer pleasure in reading 1,000-fold. Let me give you an example. For instance, take a beautifully designed building. I can look at that building and I can say, oh, that's really beautiful. I love looking at that building. But that's all I know because I know nothing about architecture. An architect can look at that building and say, oh, that's beautiful because all of these disparate elements work together, have been put together by the architect and the builder, and they all work together to create an overall effect. So the architect will take infinitely greater amounts of pleasure from looking at the thing because the architect knows how it works. The architect's in on the secret. I take pleasure from it, but not as much because I don't know anything about how it works. So our first job is to analyze the stories in that way as created objects, a thing that is made by the craftsmanship of the author. If the people in the story are real, that's fine. If they're completely made up, that's also fine. It doesn't really matter. So the first thing is not to try to get at the intention of the author, because most of the time you can't. Authors and writers are notorious about telling you what something means. Most writers, if you ask them what it means, they're going to say, I don't know, you figure it out. They don't want to tell you. They want you to figure it out on your own. So the reason we're studying this in this class is to notice those elements that we've learned about in the chapters and then say, here's this story, this thing that has been created by this writer. Here are the elements that go together in this story. Here are the way they worked. Here is the way they work together. And then to make the judgment, and that's the argumentation part of this class, to make the judgment about whether it works or not. So that's the first thing to think about. In the little business with the name of cross, here's how I figured that out, and it's not that it's particularly difficult, it's just that I know how to do it because I learned how to do this. And the way I looked at it was there is this gradual increase in detail and, in a sense, the weight of the responsibility for the death of Lavender remember the things they carried, and one of the things that they carried was their physical stuff, but another thing they carried was this sense of corporate responsibility for what happened to their comrade. And so the story shows this increasing shift onto, Lieutenant Cross, of responsibility, until finally there's this epiphany at the end in which Cross realizes something important about himself. Remember, Cross is a thing. Cross is not a person. Lieutenant Cross is an artifact created by the writer, even if it's based on a real person. The thing in the story is a created artifact. So that's had me thinking, okay, well, there's this gradual shift of responsibility and this sort of acceptance of the responsibility at the end. And then I thought, well, that's interesting. What about this guy's name, Cross? It's not the most common name in the world, although it could have been random. But I thought, well, let's play with the idea that it might have been deliberately created. And then I thought, okay, well, what does cross mean in Western iconography? And the cross, and you don't have to be a believer or a Christian or a religious person to understand the idea of cross in Western iconography as we understand it in our culture. Even if you're not a believer, the cross is the place where responsibility was shifted onto a scapegoat, and the scapegoat accepted that responsibility and changed the way things went. You don't have to believe the story to recognize the motif that's at work here. It's the same set of circumstances. You may believe the cross story, you may not, but it's the same set of circumstances. So I thought, okay, well then it's a reasonable case that cross was deliberately chosen as a name to import that other set of meaning, because it's the same set of meaning, and then I made my case that it makes sense. And that's the second piece of this class. The first piece is to appreciate the elements of fiction and how they work, and learn how they work. No one's born knowing this. This is a learned craft. No one is born with this instinct. It's a trained, cultured instinct. So the first step is to notice the elements, notice how they work, make a judgment about how they work, and talk about how they work. The second piece, the argumentation piece, is then to state your position and make a case for it. And here's where the community comes in. So with a community of scholars, even if it's this community that meets for 16 weeks and then disbands and probably never comes together again, it is a community of scholars. And so when I take a position on something that we're studying, my position can't be so idiosyncratic that it doesn't make any sense. For instance, I can't really argue that the things they carried the story is a speculation about what it might be when people land the first colony on Mars. That would be ridiculous. I could probably do it because I'm good at this kind of stuff, because I've been practicing it for a long time. But that would be ridiculous. So my positions, what I'm arguing, is not that my position is true or that everyone should accept it. What I'm arguing is that my position is reasonable, drawn from the evidence. I'm making an argument that the name cross was deliberately chosen to import this other story, and then I make my case that that's a reasonable interpretation based on the evidence. I don't get to just make stuff up out of my head when I'm in a community of scholars. So that's the second piece. I state my position, and then I make a case for my position that is reasonable given the evidence that I have. And then I support that position to the best of my ability. So the first thing I did was notice the name Cross, and notice that it's a somewhat unusual name, and then notice how that character, that artifact works in the story, what purpose does it serve? It serves as the place where all this responsibility is shifting. And then I thought, okay, well, where else have we seen in this culture that word cross, where responsibility, blame, whatever you want to call it, is also shifted? And then I thought, okay, it's in the religious iconography of this culture, part of it. And then I thought, okay, well, then I get why this might have been done, and I made those connections. Again, not because I'm so terribly smart, but because I've learned to notice these things, and once I've noticed these things, I've learned how to make a reasonable case for my position. That's what this class is designed to do. So I just wanted to kind of jump in and talk about how I arrived at that conclusion in a way that seemed reasonable to me and, should seem reasonable to anyone. You don't have to accept it, but you would notice that it's a reasonable position, which means that I've argued my case effectively. So that's what we're supposed to be trying to do. But there's two things that we're doing that don't always are not always easy to do. The first thing is to notice, to accept that a story is a thing. It's a piece of created work. Everything in a story is there deliberately, like every stroke on a canvas is a deliberate stroke, down to the tiniest little stroke, done deliberately to create an effect. Just like every note in a piece of music is placed there deliberately to create an effect, every element, every word, every paragraph, every character structure, every setting, every bit of dialogue, all of that is deliberately placed in the story to serve the central effect. So to read a story and take it as true or to take it as untrue is really not to say anything of any value. Here's the thing, how does it work? That's the question, and what elements are coming to bear on it. And then once we've reached that opinion, that position, then to argue that your position is a reasonable one based upon what you know and based upon the evidence before you that your position is a reasonable one, and then other reasonable people can discuss. In the process of that, I know it may be hard to believe, but in the process of noticing all that, at least for me, my sheer pleasure in reading was increased 1,000-fold. And I'm always a little freaked out when people say, I hate reading. My response is, if you hate it, then you don't know how to do it. It's that simple. So that's my response. I'm appreciating the discussion very much, and I just wanted to kind of pop this out there for you. So talk to you later. Bye.